started this new series we've titled Creed. And Creed, in this series, we want to go through the Apostles' Creed and talk about what we believe, what's important to us, what is our theology, and why does it matter? Who are we as followers of Jesus Christ? And as Josh just said, the Creed starts with, I believe in God the Father. It's a huge statement. And I love how for thousands of years, over 1,500 years, Christians have been saying, I believe in not just God, but God the Father. And we just don't have a God who is our Father. We have a God who is a good Father. And that's what I want to focus on today. Because I think sometimes as Christians we can miss that He's not just our Father, that we have a very, very good Father. Maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but I think there are two kinds of fathers. There's mean fathers, there's bad fathers, and then there's good fathers. For example, when I say that, years ago, I used to be a college pastor in Los Angeles. And when I was a college pastor, we had a high school pastor, and I worked with him for like a year. He worked out all the time. He was very fit, had a lot of energy, wasn't married, didn't have kids, but always had a crazy story, it seemed like. Well, one morning I come to work, and I said, well, how are you doing? He says, oh, man, I had a kind of a crazy night last night. I said, well, what happened last night? He said, well, I went to 7-Eleven to get something to eat. So that's, he's not married. He's going there to eat. And he said, I'm walking through 7-Eleven, and he said, I see a father and his son, and the son's maybe 8 or 9 years old. And he said, I don't know what the son said or did, but all of a sudden this father just whacked him in the back of the head. And I said, wow. I said, so what'd you do? He says, well, I went up behind him, and I went behind that father, and went bam in the back of his head. And I said, it doesn't feel so good, does it? Now, that's actually what he did. I don't know if it's a right thing. I'm not encouraging this at all. But when you see that, you go, man, that's a bad father. If you have a father who's just waiting to go, that'll learn you. What kind of father is that? That's why I say I think there's maybe two kinds of father. I think some people have that idea of God, that God is waiting to punish us and show us, and that we have a vindictive, angry God instead of the loving God that the Bible and Jesus shows us over and over. I want to look at today how we have a good Father. When Jesus comes on the scene 2,000 years ago, the Hebrew people lived a very neurotic life because they picked up so many of the Canaanite traditions and beliefs about their God, small g, and applied them to our God, that God was waiting to punish you if you did something wrong. And so the Jewish people have something called the Talmud. The Talmud is a collection of rules and regulations. They're not from the Bible. They are laws that for years the rabbis have written and become written tradition for them. And for example, when I say the Jewish people lived in constant neurotic fear of being punished by God, you see it in the Talmud. For example, the Talmud says it has all kinds of rules for the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, you, for example, could not take a bath or a shower, because if you spilled water on the floor, then that would be considered washing the floor and you're working. So that wasn't allowed. On the Sabbath, you couldn't kill an insect because that'd be considered hunting and you might eat it. I don't know who eats insect. On the Sabbath, if you were you couldn't carry a needle because then you'd be tempted to sew something, or you'd be doing the work of a seamstress. If you weren't even allowed to look in the mirror on the Sabbath because the fear was you would see a gray hair and then you'd be tempted to pull out that hair and you'd be a hairstylist, something like. And these are all true. These are all in the Talmud. If somebody was sick or wounded, you could keep them alive, but you couldn't treat them to help them heal because then you'd be doing the work of a doctor. And so that's how people lived in this constant fear of trying to please God, because the fear was, if I don't do these things to please God, then my Father in heaven is going to be mad at me and He's going to punish me. And then Jesus comes along and He starts reminding everyone that, no, you have a loving God. But this idea of an angry, mean God isn't just a Hebrew idea. I think it's a modern church idea. Because I don't know about you, but I grew up in a Christian culture where we were constantly living in fear of being punished by God. Now, let me be frank here. Sin is real and there are consequences. Sin is wrong and there are consequences. But the culture I lived in Hardly anyone said anything about a loving, gracious God. We lived in constant fear of retribution for our sins. So, for example, there was a famous sermon that had been preached in the 1800s, and as a kid, I knew this sermon well. It was titled, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And the preacher in this sermon talks about a spider that's dangling by a single thread over an open flame. And the preacher says, your life is like that. In other words, at your next sin, you could end up burning in hell. And so as a kid, we weren't supposed to dance, go to R-rated movies. So, if you sneak out of the house and go to Fast Times at Ridgemont High, you're going to burn in hell. That was the kind of fear I lived with. I don't know about you. And it's true, even at age like 11, 12, I kept giving my life back to Jesus Christ over and over, praying the sinner's prayer over and over because I was afraid that God was mad at me. But then Jesus comes and he reminds us that you have a good Father, a gracious Father. You don't have to perform anymore. You don't have to live in fear anymore. You don't have to try to keep God happy with you. And then Jesus, over his time on earth, especially his years in ministry, becomes this living, breathing manifestation of God on earth, showing how good he is, how he heals, he embraces children, he forgives sinners, he gives dignity to people who didn't have it, and he shows us a picture of a good God. In Matthew chapter 7, in his first sermon, Jesus says this. He says, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone, or if he asks for a fish, would give him a snake? If you then, though you're evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? Do you see, Jesus is trying to say, you have a good God. Sometimes you miss it. Chris Tomlin, we've been singing his song here for a while at the Grove, Good, Good Father. He says this, I've heard 1,000 stories of what they think you're like, but I've heard the tender whisper of your love in the dead of night. And you tell me that you're pleased and that I'm never alone. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. I hope those words and Jesus' words sink in with you today. Like I said, I think there's two kinds of fathers. I think there's good fathers who are patient and gracious and loving with their kids. And then there are bad fathers who are mean and vindictive. For me, growing up, I know what a good father looks like, I think, because I believe I had a very good father. I can't remember my father ever losing his temper at me and my twin brother. I can't remember him ever really raising his voice at us in anger. He was wise, he was patient, he was calm, he was a good, good father. But growing up all the way through elementary school, I had a friend, I'll say his name's Mike. His father, I don't think he was a good father because Mike was always grounded. It seemed like half the time I knew him, he was grounded. Sometimes for days, he was grounded, times for weeks at a time, or he would show up to hang out with us and he would have welts on the back of his legs from where his father had taken a belt and beat him. And Mike was always constantly, neurotically afraid of getting home on time or doing something while he's hanging out with us that he was going to be punished for later. He lived in constant fear of his father. I had a good father. I was obedient, but I don't think I was obedient as a kid because I was afraid of my father. Now, I had older brothers who tended to get in a lot of trouble. I have 3 older brothers, and they did things like, when I say they caused problems, one of them borrowed, you could say stole, my grandfather's credit card to rent a helicopter to take a girl on a date. All right, they did those kinds of things. One of them, I'm not making this up, one of them took a Corvette on a test drive in Jackson, Mississippi, and took it to Vancouver, Canada, all right? That's the kind of trouble they got in. So I'm not speaking for those guys. But me and my twin brother seemed to never get in trouble. Not that I was perfect, but here's the thing. I wasn't the obedient son or a good son because I was afraid of my father. I was obedient and I think a cooperative son because I loved my father. My fear, if I did something wrong, wasn't that my father was going to punish me in some harsh way. My fear, if I did something wrong, was that I would disappoint my father. And it was because I loved my father so much and didn't want to disappoint him, I didn't do things like swipe my grandfather's credit card and rent a helicopter. I didn't do that. But because I had a father who was good. And I would wonder this, what's a better motivation, to do something because you fear someone or to do something because you love someone? I have this key idea on the screen this morning. I hope it kind of sticks with you. Today, you are invited to reclaim this radical, revolutionary message of Jesus Christ, that God, your Father, is a good, good Father. You know, more than 260 times in the Bible, God is called your Father. And sometimes we miss that you have a Father in heaven who provides for you, who takes care of you, who is watching out for you, who loves you, who's protecting you, advocating for you. When I think about that, I can't help but think of my own wife. My wife, Veronica, when she was 8 years old, her father left home and never came back. And when I met her in college, she said something that I had never heard anyone say before. Veronica said, I don't know what we're talking about. She says, well, God is my father. And I never heard someone. I said, what do you mean God is your father? And she explained that God had always, since her father left, protected her, provided for her. She says, God is the one who got me into Biola University. I can't afford it, but God put me here, got me here. God is my father. She always knew she was loved by her Father in heaven. I think maybe some of you here who grew up without a father understand the love of God, our Father, more than even I do, who grew up with a good father. I think this is why Jesus even calls our Father in heaven Abba, which means dad. But Jesus tells us a good father story in the Bible. And so today I want to use this story in Scripture to kind of give us a theology of God. It's a theology proper, but an understanding of who God is and what he's like. It's a story you've heard before, but I hope as I read it today, you hear it with fresh ears and new eyes. So this is Luke. It's a story we call the story of the prodigal. Luke chapter 15, verse 11. Then Jesus said, once there was a father who had 2 sons. The younger son came to his father and said, Father, don't you think it's time to give me my share of your estate? So the father went ahead and distributed between the 2 sons their inheritance. Shortly afterwards, the younger son packed up all of his belongings and traveled off to see the world. He journeyed to a faraway land where he soon wasted all he was given in a binge of extravagant and reckless living. With everything spent and nothing left, he grew hungry because there was severe famine in the land. The son finally realized what he was doing, and he thought, there are many workers at my father's house who have all the food they want and plenty to spare. They lack nothing. Why am I dying of hunger, feeding these pigs and eating their slop? I want to go back home to my father's house, and I'll say to him, Father, I was wrong. I have sinned against you. Move down. So the son set off for home. From a long distance away, the father saw him coming, dressed as a beggar, and great compassion swelled up in his heart for his son who was returning home. The father raced out to meet him, swept him up in his arms, hugged him dearly, and kissed him over and over with tender love. Then the son said, Father, I was wrong. I have sinned against you. I could never deserve to be called your son again. Just let me be. And the father interrupted and said, Son, you're home now. Turning to his servants, the father said, Quick, bring me the best robe, my own robe, and I will place it on his shoulders. Bring me my ring, and I'll put it on his finger. Verse 25, now the older son was out working in the field when his brother returned. And as he approached the house, he heard the music of celebration and dancing. And he called over one of the workers and asked, What's going on? And the servant replied, It's your younger brother. He's returned home, and your father is throwing a party to celebrate his homecoming. The older brother became angry and refused to go in and celebrate. So the father came out and pleaded with him, Come enjoy the feast with us. And the son said, Father, I've never once disobeyed you, but you've never thrown me a party. And the father said, It's only right to rejoice and celebrate like this because your brother was once dead and gone, But now he's alive, back with us again. He was lost, and now he's found. It's a powerful story, isn't it? And the story starts with this very simple line. There was a man with 2 sons. And usually we make this story about the younger brother, right? We call it the prodigal, the son who's rebellious and he runs away. We usually make the story about him. But maybe, just maybe, this story is most about the Father. Maybe Jesus wants us most to understand how loving and gracious and patient and forgiving that our Father in heaven is. So we read that there's 2 sons. We have one, the youngest son. He's the last born. He's the baby of the family, a little spoiled, all right, slightly irresponsible, always gets his way, all right, but he's the life of the party and everybody loves him. He's the youngest son. And then you have the oldest brother, the eldest son. Now, the eldest son, he's the firstborn. He's naturally in charge. He's a rule follower. He makes his bed in the morning. He cleans his room. The problem is he makes his brother feel small when he criticizes him. He's judgmental and he's proud. Now, what you see in the story is there's no mention of a middle child. Middle children, psychologists say, are the healthiest and the most well-adjusted. So there's no mention of them, just the oldest and the youngest. And so the youngest boy asked for his inheritance. And the father, now this is a big deal in Hebrew culture because this is a lot of what he owns. And so this father has to liquidate assets. This takes some time. The whole village, the whole community, the whole tribe knows what's happening. And finally, after it could be weeks of selling his assets and getting the money together, he finally gives it to his son. And his son takes his trust fund and he leaves town. And he goes to a city where you can lose your money in a day, where there's partying 24/7, where there's pleasure and drinking and temptation and gluttony. He goes to that city. And you know, we have a city like that in our country, don't we? We have a city just like that. You know the city that I'm thinking about, don't you? Scottsdale. Scottsdale. All right, some of you are from Scottsdale, and we love you. Just making that up. Anyway, but the son, he ends up losing it all. He ends up broke, and he's hungry. He's feeding pigs, and he starts dreaming about going home. But the boy is hesitant to go home, isn't he? One of my favorite writers, John Ortberg, explains why. He says, because in Hebrew culture, if a son takes the family's wealth, takes the family, everything the family owns, takes his inheritance, and he goes and he lives among the Gentiles, but then he loses it all. Instead of making the family proud, he shames the family and he loses everything. When that son tries to come home, he said in Hebrew culture, they're no longer welcome. In fact, there's a ceremony that they perform. It's called kizezar. And the Hebrew culture is a very visual culture. He said they literally would take a clay pot, and the village elders would go out to the front gate to meet the son who's coming back from losing the family's wealth. And they would take that pot and they would break the clay pot on the ground. And they would say to this young man, they would say, "You have broken our village like this. You have broken your family like this. You have ruined it. You have broken the hearts of your mother and your father, and you are not welcomed here anymore." In fact, kizezar means to cut off. They will say, "You are cut off. Don't bother coming back to this village because you are cut off. You're not wanted here." And so this boy, as he's away feeding the pigs, you know that he's thinking about kizezar. You know that he believes there's a risk. If I go home, then maybe I won't be wanted or accepted there. And so he prepares a speech. He wants to plead with his father, "Hey, just take me in as one of your workers." But here's what that young son did not expect. He did not expect or anticipate a loving, forgiving father. He did not expect to run into a good father. And so as the story goes on, we read that the father, it sounds like, has been scanning the horizon. It could be for days, weeks, months, but every day he's looking out on the horizon. Is there a chance my son comes home today? And then on this one day, he sees way out in the distance, he sees his silhouette against the sky, and he thinks, maybe that's my son. Could that be? And he starts to walk toward him, and he's thinking, maybe that's my son. And then he sees his gait. He sees the way his son walks, that only his son walks, and he says, I'm pretty sure that's my son. So now he's jogging. Now he's broken into a jog. And then as he gets closer, he sees that really is my son, and he breaks into, Luke says, a dead sprint. He's running like a racer. He's running as fast as he can. Some say that the father was running because he wanted to get to the son first, because he didn't want someone else from the village to get there and say, Ki Zezar, you're not wanted here, you're cut off, and leave. He didn't want anyone else to meet his son first, so he wanted to get there first, so he runs. And we read that he grabs him and he embraces him and he picks him up. Do you see how Jesus wants us to get this anxious love of the Father? That all we have to do is take one step toward him and he comes running to us. Here's the thing, strong, in control, respectable Hebrew men, Jewish men, do not run. They didn't show their ankles. They didn't pull up their robes and run. But do you see how because the Father in Jesus' story is filled with compassion, filled with grace, filled with forgiveness, he runs. And that same love, it's there waiting for you. The son, we read, tries to give his speech, right? He has his speech he's been working on and practicing, and he tries to give the speech, and the father just cuts him off and says, no, you're home now, you're home now. And so just come back in with me. Of course, we read about the older brother, because there's a lot of people that go to church who are like the older brother. And the older brother just wants to judge him and ridicule him and doesn't understand the good father. I've gone to church, other churches, not the Grove, other churches where there are people that go to church like that. And I just want to remind you today that the love of the Father is there for all of us. Sometimes we miss it. Sometimes we forget about it. And it's there for you. Philip Yancey, who's one of my favorite Christian authors, has had a book out for a while titled, What's So Amazing About Grace? And in What's So Amazing About Grace, he has a chapter titled The Lovesick Father. All right, let me read to you. He shares a modern day version of Jesus' story that makes it maybe come a little bit more alive for us. Let me read this just as we close. It'll be the last thing that I share. A young woman grows up in a cherry orchard just above Traverse City, Michigan. Her parents, a bit old-fashioned, tend to overreact to her nose ring, the music she listens to, and the length of her skirts. They ground her a few times, and she sees inside. She says, I hate you, she screams, when her father knocks on her door after an argument. And that night, she acts on a plan that she's been rehearsing in her mind for months. She runs away from home and leaves for Los Angeles. Her second day in LA, she meets a man who drives the biggest car she's ever seen. He offers her a ride. He buys her lunch. He arranges for her a place to stay. He gives her pills that make her feel better than she's ever felt before. She's thinking she's right all along, she decides. Her parents were keeping her from all the fun. The man with a big car, she calls him boss, teaches her a few things that men like, and she begins to earn some money. After a year, though, however, signs of illness appear, and it amazes her how fast the boss turns mean. Before she knows it, she's out on the street without a penny to her name. When winter blows in, she finds herself sleeping on a metal grate outside the big department stores. One night, she lays awake, and all of a sudden, everything about her life looks different. She no longer feels like a woman of the world. She feels like a little girl lost in a cold and frightening city, and she begins to whimper. Her pockets are empty. She's hungry. She needs a fix. She pulls her legs up underneath her as she shivers under the newspapers that she's piled on top of her coat. Something jolts a memory, and a single image fills her mind of May in Traverse City, when 1,000,000 cherry trees blossom at once, and her golden retriever runs through the rows and rows of blossoming trees. God, why did I leave, she says to herself, and the pain stabs her heart. She's sobbing now, and she knows in a flash that more than anything in the world, she wants to go home. 3 straight phone calls, 3 straight connections with voicemail. She hangs up the first 2 times, but the third time she leaves a message. Dad, Mom, it's me. I wanted to ask, can I come home? I'm catching a bus. That's all I can afford your way. I'll get there about midnight tomorrow. If you're not at the bus station, I guess I'll just stay on the bus until it reaches New York City. On the bus ride, she keeps rehearsing the speech that she's preparing for her father. Dad, I'm sorry. I was wrong. It's not your fault. It's mine. Dad, can you forgive me? She says. She says the words over and over until her throat is dry. When the bus finally rolls into the station, she checks herself in her compact mirror. She smooths her hair, licks the lipstick off her teeth. She walks into the bus terminal, not knowing what to expect. But none of the thousands of scenes that have played out in her mind prepare her for what she sees next. There in this cold, stark bus station in Traverse City, Michigan, stand a group of 40 brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and cousins and neighbors and a grandmother and a great-grandmother to boot. They're all wearing goofy party hats and blowing noisemakers, and taped across the entire wall of the bus terminal is a banner that reads, "Welcome home." Out of the crowd breaks her father. She stares through the tears in her eyes, and she begins to give her speech. Dad, I'm sorry. I'm wrong. But he interrupts her. He says, hush, sweetheart. We've got no time for that. We don't need an apology. He said, you'll be late for the party. Dinner is waiting for you at home. And he ends the story there. Could I invite you to do this where you are right now? Would you stand? And as you stand, would you go ahead and close your eyes and bow your heads? Because maybe you need the love of the Father more than you ever have in your life. And with your eyes closed and your head bowed, I want you to think about the Father in heaven the way Jesus tells us He is. I want to remind you today that you have a Father that loves you no matter what. And I invite you to pray these words with me. God, I'm tired of running away. God, I'm ready to come home. God, I need your love, and I believe in your love and your goodness today. God, thank you for being my good, good Father, because that's what I need now more than anything else. And I want you to know that I love you too. God, thank you that I can live in your love and forgiveness, not just today, but every day for the rest of my life, now and for eternity. I thank you for that, my God in heaven, my Father. Amen. Amen.